Some of the comments that came out from the previous presentation that didn't get a chance to be worked into the discussion, many of them are topics we're going to be talking about later in the weekend, or that you will go home to your local communities and talk about as well. And I found that many of them fit under the heading of what is the future of the Jewish community? Will it be open and welcoming, like Chabad, creative and vibrant, and that's why people find it attractive? Will it be a community that is modeled on something other than the synagogue and the obligation model that Paul Golan talked about so eloquently? Or will it be a future where the definitions are fuzzier to include more people? And that's one of the challenges we face going forward, looking at this population of emerging young adults, how they identify, and with whom they connect. One other question that came up, a more logistical question, is people were curious to get access to the statistics provided by Paul Golan in his presentation. And what we can do is, after this weekend, you can contact the Institute office. We will create what's called a PDF or an Adobe Reader file of his presentation, and we can send that to you so you can have all the statistics at your fingertips, along with contact information for the Jewish Outreach Institute, which conducted the studies involved. This session will be chaired or facilitated by Denise Handlarski, a rabbinic student in our program and also a recent PhD graduate from York University in Toronto. And so, without any further ado, I want to turn over the microphone and the stage to Denise.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for making it back from lunch. Before we get going, I've been thinking all morning about the very first time I went to an event on the subject of intermarriage. It was run by Chabad in my community, and I was hanging out with some of the Chabad people, and the topic was, the name of the event was called The Dangers of Intermarriage. I said, maybe we can change the title, because unless we're really only talking about the dangers, I think that closes off the conversation. They said, what about the problems of intermarriage? I said, well, I still sort of feel like we're answering a question before it's been asked. So they said, what about the question of intermarriage? And ultimately, we settled on intermarriage. So it's a very Jewish kind of conversation, I think. In this session, we are talking about emerging adulthood. Our speakers are Dan Liebenson and Yoni Saracen. So I'll introduce both of them, and they're doing a collaborative presentation. Dan Liebenson is president of the Institute for the Next Jewish Future, a think tank and education center dedicated to accelerating the development of a resonant and compelling 21st century Judaism. He is the former executive director of the University of Chicago's Neuberger Hillel Center, an Avichai Fellow in 2009. He previously taught law at the University of St. Thomas Law School in Minneapolis. He has been named a Richard M. Joel Exemplar of Excellence, International Hillel's highest professional award. And Yoni Saracen is the Midwest Regional Director of Birthright Israel Next. He also founded the St. Louis Moshe House, next door St. Louis, the St. Lou Jew. He was a 2010 Present Tense Fellow and a 2011 ROI Fellow, and again, currently the Midwestern Director of what is now called Next, a division of Birthright Israel Foundation. So please join me in welcoming Dan and Yoni.
Thank you, Denise. Good afternoon. First of all, thank you, Rabbi Shalom, for putting together what has already been a really fascinating morning and promises to be a fascinating rest of the weekend. I have the great pleasure, actually, of sharing the stage today with Dan Liebenson. Over the course of our conversations relating to this session, I've learned really what a brilliant guy and a visionary he is. And so I'm just so thrilled to be up here with him and to be able to talk to you guys about some of the larger trends that we're seeing. Paul earlier today spoke about young adults who are the children of intermarriages and their perspectives. I'm going to take a step back from that, as is Dan, and actually talk a little bit more about some of the broader trends in American society and how those are impacting Jews in America. Because it's after lunch, and many of us have the tendency after lunch to be a little sleepy, we figured that we'd keep you on our toes by doing a little switcheroo. So I'm going to start off a little bit with the context of what's different about this generation, Dan's going to talk a little bit about this idea of emergent adulthood, what he saw in his work with students on campus. I'll come back to sort of more of the issues with the Jewish community and young adults. There's a huge debate that has raged in psychology for as long as there has been a field of psychology, and that is the debate of nature versus nurture. Today, in order to set some context, would like to talk a bit about the environment in which a person grows up and how it sets the stage for the rest of their life. When we're talking about young adults, we're talking about people who are at the tail end of Generation X, the entire generation called millennials. Those are people born between the early 80s and 90s. And the eldest of Generation I. Generation I is an iPod, iPhone, internet. These are people who didn't grow up without the internet. And I just want you to think about that for just a moment. There are several major trends which make these individuals, these people who are young adults today, distinct and unique from past generations. And while many of these may seem obvious, I'd like to nevertheless single out a few of them. The first is the marked decline of anti-Semitism, not just in the United States, but around the world. The ADL just released their annual report and said that once again, incidents of anti-Semitism were down versus the previous year. This generation has grown up in an America in which anti-Semitism does not provide actual dangers to their life, nor limitations to their potential progress. For 1900 years, Judaism was a religion and a people who were powerless and oppressed. We couldn't own land in many countries, we couldn't freely live our lives, and we were deeply shaped and scarred by this persecution, which, it should be noted, did follow us to America and was present up to maybe 40 years ago in a real way. What effect did that have on us? We as a Jewish people closed our ranks. We closed ourselves off to other people as a way to protect ourselves. But that's changed. Gone are the quotas on being accepted into elite universities. Gone are the white-only country clubs that we didn't qualify for. You go to the East Bank Club here in Chicago, which is widely considered the most elite of country club type health spas in the city. It's majority Jewish, right? Not only are the quotas gone, but in fact, Jews are now a disproportionately large percentage of students at all of the top universities, right? In most of the sort of high impact and high earning jobs, Jews find themselves disproportionately represented. To put it simply, we done all right. This has had a profound impact on how we see ourselves, right? When we weren't able to have access to all of the elite programs, when we weren't able to see ourselves as fully American, we saw ourselves as American Jews. If you look at who created the majority of what we think of oftentimes as American culture, it was Jews who were creating the cultural icons that they wanted to aspire to. Both DC and Marvel comics were created by Jews. Superman's original Kryptonian name is Hebrew. It's Kal-El. Seriously. Most of the songs written about Christmas are written by Jews. Right? If you look today at what the popular representations of Jews are in American culture, it's no longer Jews who are writing music for chess records and owning chess records. It's no longer Jews who are creating what they think the American stereotype is and trying to find a way to be that, right? Matisyahu is over the top Jewish, or at least he was until he shaved his beard, right? Drake, who's a famous Canadian Jewish and African American rapper, recently released a song which begins with pictures of him at his bar mitzvah and a credit that says, on this date, the rapper Drake decided to recommit himself to the Jewish faith by having a second bar mitzvah. The entire music video takes place in a shul. Right? We no longer have to represent what we think other people's ideals of American are, or what we think should be American. We actually can represent stereotypes of ourselves as perfectly American. That is a huge shift. In addition to that shift, we no longer have to see ourselves as American Jews, and in fact, most of us see ourselves as Jewish Americans if we use the term Jewish at all. It used to be that whether you decided to be an anarchist, an atheist, a secular humanist, or a Buddhist, you were a Jewish atheist, you were a Jewish Buddhist. That's simply no longer the case. And in fact, most of the people behind the American Buddhist movement, Krishna Das, for example, his original name is like Goldstein. I mean, these are folks who came from a generation in which they could play around with their identity in different ways. And as a result, we as a generation, whether one or both of our parents are Jewish in some way or any way or not at all, we can actually leave behind the Jewish community in ways that we couldn't before. The state of Israel. My grandparents couldn't have in their wildest dreams imagined that the state of Israel would have come to fruition during their lifetime, would have survived. My father was one of the first American Jews to get to stand at the Western Wall in 1967. I grew up with an Israel that was the single largest, most dominant military power in the Middle East. It has not had a truly militarily existential threat since I or any of my generation have been alive. Simply put, the sort of Judaism that was based on being afraid of the outside world because the outside world was threatening us is not a part of my life, and it has never been. That we as Jews have our own state, relative affluence, and quality of life in many countries mean that we are no longer a powerless people. We have agency, and that single fact alone makes us an entirely different people than we have been since the destruction of the Second Temple. And that's a long time ago, for those of you who weren't sure. But let's talk about some sort of broader American trends, right? There has been a decline in social and family cohesion. Between 1950 and 2010, the number of households with just one person tripled. The prevalence of single adults living happily into their 20s and 30s without getting married is a almost totally new phenomenon. Further, as communities and families are more geographically spread, and I don't just mean suburban sprawl, literally as extended families live across state lines in ways that did not exist before, families and social communities are no longer the type of cohesive bodies that they used to be. And what were families and social groups incredibly good at? Transmitting culture. Families are the primary method of cultural transmission, and the fact that there is a decline in the cohesion of families, both the nuclear family and the extended family, means that ability to translate culture and values has also declined. Ubiquitous university attendance. Here we sit at Northwestern, one of the top 10 universities, depending on if you believe Northwestern or U.S. News and World Report. Enrollment has grown 4 times faster in the 2000s than it did in the 1990s, right? Full-time students, this is an all-time high in history of full-time enrollment in this country, 70%. 70% of people are enrolling after high school in full-time programs as students.
Jewish people.
across the board. Jews are even higher at about 80%. And in fact, this is one of Hillel's taglines. The single thing that most Jews have in common is that they will attend university in this country. That's why Hillel is there. That's literally what they say. Which is a really fascinating point, right? But this increase in degrees has not translated into an increase in jobs created for graduates, right? The cost of tuition has also reached an all-time high, which means that the value of that degree has actually decreased. Now, maybe not at the top 5 universities. You're still more likely to get a job coming out of them, but across the board, more people are coming out with degrees. Those degrees are worth less competitively in the marketplace, and they're carrying far more debt than they ever have. Average student loan debt is above $25,000. Finally, no conversation about this generation would be complete without talking about the recession, right? My graduating year from college was the last year in which a large number of people got full-time gainful employment.
What year was that?
That year was 2007. My brother's graduation year, 2009, was the first year in which it became standard for those graduating from university actually to move home. That is a major shift. Okay, with so much stacked against us, can you blame us for not wanting to actually reach adulthood? Right, I mean, what adulthood had to offer us is suddenly out of reach, right? I mean, how do you define adulthood? Traditionally, there are markers of adulthood, right? Graduating from university, reaching financial independence, living alone, getting married, having children. Every single one of these pieces is being pushed further out. And in fact, the single largest descriptor of this generation is that we are getting married later than ever before in recorded history. That has created an entire life period, right? It used to be if you went to university, you would graduate, get married immediately if you weren't already married by the time you graduated, move in with your new wife, husband, or whomever, and start a family. That's what you did, right? Now there's an entire gap of 5 to 15 years in which people are not married. It's an entirely new market. And it comes with some really, really interesting new challenges and opportunities. And so I want to invite Dan up to speak about what's being called emergent adulthood.
So thanks. I also want to thank Adam and AJ and everyone who's put this together. Lynn said earlier this morning that Adam and AJ are so organized. I'm sort of the opposite. A few months ago, Adam asked me, we were talking about this event, and I said, now what date is that again? And he just blanched, but I got here. So just to explain what we're doing, I mean, what Yoni's introduction is about is just explaining that whether somebody has one Jewish parent or two Jewish parents, young people today coming on campus and beginning adulthood and graduating from college and going into the young adult world that Yoni works with are living in the world. We're all living in the world, and the world is changing, and the world is changing in profound and important ways, and Yoni's given us that introduction. I'm talking mostly from the perspective of somebody who spent the last 6 years working on college campus with students at the very beginning of adulthood, at the very beginning of, let's actually say, the transition to adulthood. We'll talk about that. And we're not scholars. We're talking from the perspective of what do we think we're seeing, and we're going to do a little description now. I'm going to give you a little bit more context. We're going to do a little description of what we think we're seeing, and then we'll try to come back at the end and say a little bit about what we think it means, and then have a conversation about it. So Paul introduced this statistic earlier, and this is definitely confirmed by experience that on college campuses today, of all the people who have at least one Jewish parent, most of them only have one Jewish parent. right? That is we've shifted. We've hit the more than 50% mark, where the people on campus who will tend to answer, yes, I'm Jewish. The odds are they only have one Jewish parent. So what does that mean for Hillel or for other efforts to engage these students in Judaism so that they'll have Jewish adult lives? In addition to the things that Yoni was talking about, I wanted to talk about two things. One is that Yoni and I basically agreed that while the idea that people are, quote, half Jewish in their minds, or in whatever way they would put it, only one of my parents is Jewish, it is in their minds, and it's important, but it doesn't seem to us to be the salient issue as to whether or not somebody is going to get involved in Jewish life when they're a young adult and later on. It seems to us, and I think it would be interesting to do some studies on this, but it seems that there are really two other factors that are involved, much more so than the question of how many Jewish parents a person has. The first one is, what was the nature of the Jewish connections of that young person in the family in which they were growing up? Now, it may be that for a variety of reasons, people who grow up in a household with only one Jewish parent might be more likely, as a statistical issue, to be growing up in a household that was more distant from Judaism, but not always, not necessarily. And from all our experience, it seems that the question of what were the positive memories of Judaism in childhood, how close was your family to a Jewish life, that are the ones that seem to be most important as to whether or not somebody is coming into the transition to adulthood with an interest in and openness to Jewish experiences. But the second issue is even more important, I think, and we think, that as Yoni was starting to explain, because of the increasingly late time of life when people are getting married and having children, what's happening is that at the beginning of adulthood, at age 18, when people are coming to college, the time in which they're going to get married and have children seems so far away to them, right? It may be as far away from where they are now at age 18 as their birth was, right? Think about that. It is very far away to them. So therefore, it has no significant impact on the choices that they're making at age 18. Whereas when my parents were in college and the expectation was that they were going to get married a year or two after graduation, it was very important in their minds, the idea that who they dated would have some significance to who they married. Well, on campus, it is of no significance. It's of no relevance. The person I'm going to marry is somebody that I'm going to be dating, in 10 or 15 years from now. So why is that even an issue? All these things that their parents are, hucking them about. Go to Hillel so you'll meet a nice girl. It's not, they could meet a nice girl, but it's going to be of no consequence to the life decisions that they're going to make later. So therefore, they just don't understand it. But what the psychologists, the developmental psychologists have written about is that because of this ever latening, that's not a word, time of marriage and childbearing, that the earlier stages of adulthood have now essentially become a new developmental stage of life, where there are different developmental tasks than there were in the past. And it's really important to understand young adults, and here we're talking about basically through the 20s, definitely a transitional period, best understood rather than the beginning of adulthood, best understood as a transitional period between adolescence and adulthood, a 10, 15-year transitional period. So becomes a developmental life stage in its own right, and should be understood that when we think about those young people, we should be thinking about them as having some characteristics of adulthood. For example, independence, they can make their own decisions, etc. But also a lot of characteristics that we tend to think about in terms of adolescence. So much more changeable, pliable, open than you might have thought about adults at an earlier stage, people who are right on the cusp of adulthood. So the leading developmental psychologist who writes about this is a guy named Jeffrey Arnett, and he identifies 5 major characteristics of emerging adulthood, 2 of which we think are especially important when we think about Judaism, Jewish connection, and the children of intermarriage. The five pieces of emerging adulthood are that it's an age of identity explorations, and this is a really important one. When people come to college, no matter what their background is, they are open to exploring all sorts of possibilities. Now, what does that mean? If somebody comes to college with a positive set of Jewish experiences, that means there's no guarantees. They might be exploring Buddhism next week. So, and I've seen plenty of Orthodox students from Orthodox backgrounds who actually had good experiences. These aren't people who came to college resentful and angry. These are people who had very good experiences, drop it very quickly. And not because they're against it, because they're exploring other things. They're very open to exploration. The opportunity is that people who have had no Jewish experiences or negative Jewish experiences are extremely open to exploring Jewish experiences. That's why Birthright is so successful. Because, well, why not? Yeah, I'll go, see what happens. And they're very open to it. There are other factors. It's a time of instability. It's a very self-focused time. We talked earlier about community during Paul's talk, and it's not something students are interested in community, like my community of friends. But the idea of obligation to join a community, pay dues. I mean, it's the farthest thing from imaginable. It's a time of feeling in between. Young people definitely will describe themselves as feeling in between adolescence and adulthood. And finally, and also importantly here, it's a time of possibilities. It's a time where people are really thinking about all the possible things of my life, whereas at an earlier stage, people might have come to college saying, I know I want to be a doctor. That doesn't happen very much anymore. So what that means is that we found it to be extremely possible to engage students in Jewish life in college, but not in the way that you would typically think of a Hillel, and not in the way that their parents think of a Hillel, as sort of putting on programs and trying to sort of do some marketing to get students to come to those programs. That doesn't tend to work very well as a strategy. Instead, what works extremely well is to go out to where the students are and to offer them experiences where they are, or experiences that might take them somewhere else, like on a Birthright trip. But for example, we have, when we would do a Shabbat dinner at Hillel, the most you could get 35, 40 people to come. When we would do a Shabbat dinner out on campus in a space that the students felt is their space, right, and they're not feeling that the Jewish space is their space, but the campus space, 200 people would come. And that's significant. It's significant in two ways, right? One is it tells you that while you might think that the fact that they're not coming to Hillel means they're not interested in Judaism, turns out that's not true, because when Judaism comes to them, they're very interested. Right? And number two, it tells you that the strategy is to bring Judaism to them. The other strategy that works extremely well for us, that's worked extremely well for us at the University of Chicago and also elsewhere, is a strategy of using student interns. We pay them so that we can get enough of their time. They tend to work for us about 10 hours a week. And we essentially use a high leverage strategy where our staff doesn't put on any programs, pretty much. Our staff spends a huge amount of its time investing in these student interns. We have 16 of them now at the University of Chicago. I'd love to have 30. And basically all our staff does is invest in those interns and then sends those interns out onto campus to organize their friends, to create opportunities, programs for their friends, to invite their friends to programs, to Birthright, to all these things, with the idea that the people who know best how to engage their peers, especially because it's such a time of dynamic change, has got to be their peers. The problem is their peers don't necessarily have a lot of Jewish background and knowledge and ideas about what Judaism really should be like in order to really engage them in anything. So you try to bridge that strategy by working with the interns to try to And we talked about education a little bit earlier. I think we profoundly have to change what we mean by Jewish education, right? We've tended to mean some kind of replication. Here's all the knowledge that you need to have. Here's how to be Jewish. I think that we need to shift to an education for creativity and discovery, right? Here's a lot of stuff. Now you mix it up and create what's meaningful to you and your friends, right? Empower you to discover a Judaism that's resonant to you and people like you. But in order to do that, we have to at least tell you what Judaism has been so that you can write the next chapter. A great Jewish leader said to me a few months ago, how can you expect somebody to write the next chapter in a book if they haven't read the first 10 chapters, right? It doesn't make any sense. So we have to make sure that people know what Judaism has been, but not necessarily to make them think that that's what Judaism must be. So I want to. So that is a strategy that is working very, very well. The last thing that I want to mention about the Hillel world before turning this back to Yoni to tell a bit more what he's seeing in the post-college world is that is a story about what's going on at the University of Pennsylvania Hillel, which is that some years ago they essentially opened a second Hillel. They called it the Jewish Renaissance Project. It has a separate building, a separate staff. It is supervised by the same executive director, but essentially they're running two organizations, two brands. They're running Hillel, that's basically for the religious people, the people that are interested in traditional Jewish programs and practices, and the Jewish Renaissance Project, which is for people who are not. And for people who had never, it's like that story of the desert island, and they discovered a Jew there, and he had built three structures. One was his house, one was a synagogue, and the other was a synagogue he never would set foot in. So that's and at Penn there really are two profoundly separate organizations because they found that there was literally nothing that Hillel could do to be able to engage the students who were not interested in traditional practices. It was just they could get a few, but it was just impossible. Whereas if they could create a separate organization, they were able to do really tremendous things. We found a similar thing at the University of Chicago, and what's interesting is for a number of circumstantial reasons, next year we are actually going to be opening a new Jewish organization under the auspices of the Institute for the Next Jewish Future, which is going to essentially be the same as at Penn. So there will be a Hillel, and there will also be an organization called Jew Chicago, which is going to be oriented specifically towards empowering students to build a new Judaism, effectively, that's resonant for their peers. And for better or for worse, this is what I was asking about a little bit earlier. There may be a sense of a bifurcation, and hopefully there'll be connections between all those Jews, and we can continue to see ourselves as one community. But it's not necessarily possible to address the needs of all Jews through a single institution. That's what we've been discovering over the last few years in the Hillel world. So I'm going to turn it over to Yoni to talk a little bit more about the post-university world.
So one of the things that Dan has told me that students at Hillel will often say is, am I authentically Jewish? Am I really Jewish? And the interesting thing about this authenticity question is it's usually brought about by extrinsic forces. There's no reason for these people to question their Judaism until they run into a wall, right? That makes them question it. What we believe, though, is that when it comes to identity differences between Jews with two Jewish parents and Jews with one Jewish parent, there's actually far more common culture in terms of environmental impacts, societal influence, and aspirations between those two different children from different families than differences because of the ways that they would have been brought up. In fact, one research paper that was entitled "It's Not Just Who Stands Under the Chuppah" proposes that fundamentally flawed narratives of intermarriage that have dominated discussion need to be replaced by an alternate account of engagement. Right? The difference isn't just who the parents are. The majority of the variance is actually, how did the child grow up? What are the other influences that the child had? This means, as these researchers noted, that Jewish socialization in the form of Jewish education, experience of home ritual, and social networks plays a far more important role than having intermarried parents in determining Jewish identity, behavior, or connections. It's not just who one's parents are, but one's experiences of Jewish living, education, and friendship that determine who will go on to live a richly Jewish life. So, what changed in the Jewish community that has altered this ability to provide such socialization? Earlier I talked about the fall of anti-Semitism and the integration of Jewish communities into the mainstream. I'd like to call this the fall of the shtetl walls theory. There were a lot of people who were very, very happy when the shtetl walls fell. When the shtetl walls fell. Thank you. None of them were rabbis. At least not then. Today, this type of coercion that was manageable in a shtetl, this type of motivation where you could get people to seek refuge in the shtetl, it doesn't work. Judaism of compulsion simply doesn't work in the open society that Rabbi Shalom mentioned earlier. We have to have a Judaism which can offer a central frame of reference, something particular, something of meaning that is distinct, while also allowing for nuance and flexibility. A gentleman by the name of Dov Seidman, who's an author and speaker, has noted that whereas coercion and motivation happen to you, inspiration happens in you. Today, we can only expect our peers to want to live Jewish lives within Jewish community if they feel not only welcomed, but inspired to do so. That is, we must make a community which is both accessible and desirable, providing value not easily found elsewhere. And further, we have to allow the rules of the community to reflect the changing values of a generation that doesn't see the need for so-called Jewish defense organizations. This is the point that Dan made in empowering these interns on campus to actually work with their peers to create what they want a Jewish community to look like. Judaism is an incredibly rich tradition with a history of adapting to a changing world and creating wisdom to live by. So why are so many Jewish organizations, synagogues, and initiatives finding it so hard to connect with and inspire young adults? Well, for one, this generation, as we said, is looking for some different content and different ways of connecting than their parents were. As a result, they often see these Jewish communal organizations quite simply as anachronistic. I was speaking with someone in the community yesterday who was saying, well, where do you see your future in the Jewish community professionally? Do you want to work with federations or JCCs or Jewish defense organizations? And I kind of stared at him blankly. Right? Because these organizations don't often speak to me in the language of meaning, in the language of freedom to do something. They speak in the language of, this world is a dangerous and a complicated place to be Jewish. We can protect you. From what? I don't feel threatened. Most of my peers don't feel threatened. And I want to thank all of you for the work that you did in your lives to get me to this point. No, really, I mean, this is incredible, right? I mean, literally, we just celebrated Yom HaShoah several days ago, noted, I would say, commemorated. We celebrated the fact that we're still here, right? But after half a century, not only are we still here, we just lived through the Jewish century. We lived through a time of Jewish achievement unparalleled in history. That's incredible. But as Paul noted, that got us from the point of, how can we be American, to now, why should we be Jewish? To get to the why, let's maybe start with the where, actually. Where are Jewish communal organizations based? And where are Jewish young adults living? Right? There is a history of how Jewish communities moved, how they fled the cities, how they spread out into the suburbs. And young adults, and not just children of 2 Jewish parents or 1 Jewish parent, and not just Jews, young adults are choosing to make the cities their home for many reasons, for environmental reasons, for ideas of community, for ideas of access to certain things, right? It's not where their parents live, it's not where their grandparents live, and it's not where the Jewish community is. Not only where, but what do these buildings look like that we often find ourselves in that are called Jewish spaces? Usually, they're incredibly drab. Now, they may inspire awe. I'll give them that, right? And to the generation that put money into those buildings to build them, that's what they were looking for. It's not what I'm looking for. It's not what most of my friends are looking for. We want a sense of warmth. We want to feel like it's a place that we can be comfortable and actually critically engage. For a previous generation that knew the ritual, even if they didn't believe in it, they still did that ritual. Last night, the service that we did was ritual, right? The meanings had been adapted so that the secular Jewish humanists could feel like they weren't saying things that contradicted how they feel or what they believe, but that was still ritual. This generation is far more interested in actually engagement, not simply doing things, but critically engaging with what they are, where they come from, and in re-envisioning them in some of the ways that secular humanistic Judaism has done, but doing it for a generation that finds different needs in community, in spirituality, in an American reality. What we're finding is that many organizations in the existing Jewish infrastructure are looking to continue themselves. That's actually sort of their primary purpose, is to maintain what they're doing, because what they are doing worked really well in the past, right? It got us to where we are. It freed the Soviet Jews. It rescued the Jews from Ethiopia. It built the state of Israel. It did a lot of really incredible things. Those realities are established. And these organizations now either have to say, we're patting ourselves on the back, it's time for another organization to take up a new cause, or they have to figure out what their new cause is going to be. And instead, most of the time what's happened is these organizations are trying to find young people to fill the existing roles. And it's simply not inspiring to the majority of young adults. But there are successful engagement measures. Dan has talked about what happened at the University of Chicago Hillel, which was incredibly successful. But there are also things going on at the young adult level when people aren't sort of I don't want to call it a captive audience on campus, because Dan knows that people won't just come to a Hillel building, and his success was particularly in reaching out to them. But when people are far more geographically dispersed, there are still ways to engage people. And how do these initiatives do it? They don't rely on traditional physical spaces or a pay-to-play mentality, what Paul talked about in terms of a sort of an obligation to give, or a sense of compulsion to give. In fact, what they're doing is focusing on one-on-one engagement, right? And what is so powerful about one-on-one engagement is that somebody doesn't ask you, do you feel Jewish? How Jewish do you feel? Who was your Jewish parent? How are you Jewish? What they say is, tell me your story. How do you want to be seen? How do you want to walk in the world? What do you find compelling about the way that you grew up? And how can we connect you to people who believe similar things, who might be your primary community, or people who you might want to challenge your ideas with, or people who you might want to grow with? Moishe House is one such organization. Moishe House is built on the premise that Jewish young adults can build their own communities if you give them the resources, with 30 plus houses now across the world, Moishe House has shown that this in fact can happen. The community that I helped to build in St. Louis next door was built on the premise that each person has a set of unique talents, unique guiding inspirations, and if you provide them with a framework to bring that to a larger community, it will build a larger community, and people will feel like a part of that community themselves and will want to continue to build it. We found that to be equally resonant with people whether they had one Jewish parent, two Jewish parents, or no Jewish parents, and decided that they wanted to make Judaism their spiritual and cultural home. In trying to decide how to do outreach or engagement with young adults who have one Jewish parent, what Dan and I believe is actually you don't need different strategies. What we actually believe is that if you build programs and opportunities and relationships that are built on meaning and purpose, that people will be attracted to those programs and those opportunities regardless of who their parents are. We have to build a Judaism that is based on value. If the rest of our economy is a service-based economy and people pay for things that they find value in, we have to build a Jewish community which people are attracted to, right? As I said earlier, the Judaism of compulsion has failed. It's time for the Judaism of value. It's time for the Judaism of beauty. It's time for the Judaism of attraction. Dan has some really great ideas about how to do this, but before I turn it back to him, I want to talk about Birthright. First of all, because they're my current employer. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it. Second, because it has been the largest project of the Jewish people worldwide, certainly since the creation of the State of Israel. And you could argue there were some other things along the way. But after 300,000 Jewish young adults went on a 10-day trip to Israel, there are some incredible things that have happened as a result of that. And there's some incredible reasons why Birthright as a program is fundamentally disruptive. The first is it wasn't created inside of sort of the usual Jewish community institutions. It was created as a separate organization. It was created from a separate ideology. Birthright didn't say, you're Jewish if your mom's Jewish. Birthright said, if you have Jewish lineage and you consider yourself Jewish, then you can come on this trip. And as a result, next, the alumni division of the Birthright Foundation, for whom I work, takes the same tack. If you've been on a Birthright trip, we consider you Jewish, and we are equally as interested in talking with you and engaging you as everyone else. We don't ask questions in our engagement work as to who your parents are. We try and work with people to actually build communities that they want to be a part of. Barry Chazan, who is the educational architect of Birthright Israel, described the philosophy. He said, there is a big tent philosophy behind Birthright. We decided not to focus on halachic Jews or highest likelihood Jews, rather, anyone with Jewish ancestry. And this is a decision with meaning. In the words of Len Sachs, who has been seen as the most prolific researcher of Birthright, what we know is that Birthright has put participants on a different trajectory of Jewish engagement. Creating Jewish families, being connected with Israel, wanting to learn Hebrew and about Jewish history are actually far more important than putting them on the path of the previous generation to support the existing organizations. And that is a powerful thing to say, and that is fundamentally disruptive to the trajectory of the community that currently exists. Most people before Birthright looked at camp as that experience, right? And why? Because you see people living Jewish lives. You actually get to engage in that way. 40 people on a bus together in Israel for 10 days is able to not only create that sense of community and shared experience, but in connecting with the Israeli participants and engaging with members of Israeli society, There's something really fascinating that happens. And we talked a little bit about it earlier on the panel of how Israeli society and the secular society, for sure, has split sort of the Israeli and the Jewish personas, and how American society has taken and accepted sort of the Christian idea of religion. When these young adults go on a trip to Israel, suddenly there's a reintegrated Jewish identity that emerges. Jewish identity in this country it used to be integrated, right? You were born Jewish, you were the atheist Jew, you were the whatever Jew. You now get to choose if you want to see your religious heritage as Jewish, if you want to see your cultural heritage as Jewish, or if your parents believed in some stuff back in the day and that's just who they were. Going to Israel fundamentally, for the majority of people who go, changes the way that they see their relationship to what it means to be Jewish. Dan's going to offer some of the ways that we think this is really crucial for moving forward.
I'm going to just do this really quickly, and then so that we can have some time for the questions and answers. But what I really want to just emphasize is that we agree that that the salient characteristic is not how many Jewish parents you have, but whether you can be engaged in Jewish life. And I want to really make a distinction between, at least as I understand, two words: outreach and engagement. To my mind, what it sounds like to me, people mean different things, but what it sounds like to my ear is that outreach is something that institutions do in order to reach out and try to bring people in, whereas engagement is something that we do to empower people to build institutions and to build lives of their own. And I think engagement is our future. I think that to me, the title Half Jewish, the question of half Jewish is a question of the past. The question of the future is not who is a Jew, but what is Judaism, as we've heard before. And I want to suggest that, at first I was thinking that one way to think of it is that all of us are really half Jews, because really, don't we live lives that have so many other dimensions? But I don't think that that's the right way to think about it. I think it's rather that we should understand that the nature of Judaism has to change. Judaism evolved in a world in which people, for 2,000 years, pretty much, if you ask them who they were, they would say a Jew. It was their only identity. Over the last 200 years, maybe it was like, well, are you a Jewish American or an American Jew, right? There was some ranking. That's not true anymore. We all have multiple identities that we're 100% all of them, and that requires fundamentally a new Judaism. And I want to just give a couple of images about what happens when something like that is going on in the world. That's what. When there's a real disruption in the way the world is operating. Think, for example, of 10, 11 years ago, if you were Michael Dell and you were looking at the iPod, what would you have thought? Well, that has nothing to do with me. That's a music player, and I make computers, so who cares, right? But then the iPod started to take pictures, started to take videos, it started to make phone calls, it started to have apps, it grew a little, it became an iPad, and now it's killing Dell, right? Dell will not survive this. And when our grandchildren think about a computer, it will be the descendant of the iPad, not of the Dell desktop or laptop even. Similarly, the Dayton-Hudson Corporation understood this when the move from department stores were disrupted by the big box retailers. They understood that they needed to invest in this. They didn't really understand it. It wasn't their way of doing business. So they opened a small division called Target, and they sort of left it alone. And they let Target figure out that small market. They didn't really have a whole lot to do with it. Target grew and grew and grew. The Dayton-Hudson Corporation is now called the Target Corporation. Dayton-Hudson is now a small division of Target. And the rest of the department stores are dying. Dayton-Hudson's the only one that's surviving because it understood that the job was not to figure out how to make department stores work. The job was to figure out how to empower the next thing. And I think that that's really what the transition has to be. If you look at what's going on college campuses right now and in the young adult world, there's some cool stuff, but to my mind, it's not that cool. It looks like the iPod from my perspective as Michael Dell. But what I do see there is the potential for a new Judaism to grow from that, and to grow from people who meet the definition of being Jewish that this institute has, or analogous definitions, that empowers them to build the Judaism that they want, and that our job is to pass along to them what Judaism has been and what Judaism might have to offer so that they can take all that material and remix it in the way that Maya showed us last night, what that could look like. And I believe firmly that that will grow into a Judaism that will be a resonant and compelling Judaism for the 21st century, and I'm very optimistic about it. So thank you.
Thank you so much for such an engaging presentation. I know that the cards with questions and comments are coming up to the front. While we're waiting for the panelists to get up here, I'll just offer that as someone who turned 30 and was worried about the stuff you were saying, Yoni, about a terrible job market and all the problems you mentioned, I did two things. I married my non-Jewish partner, and I joined the rabbinic school at the IISHJ, so that was my solution.
So, Yoni, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you something about Birthright that I've heard from other people in preparing for this conference. And I fully agree with everything you said about the positives of Birthright. Something I'm not sure you said today, but you did say earlier in our conversations this weekend, is that one of the reasons Birthright is so disruptive is that people have a right to expect to be welcome. They go to Birthright, one Jewish parent, doesn't matter, you're in, on you go. And then they come back and say, why can't I do that everywhere? But it isn't necessarily the case that it's only one Jewish parent, or that do you consider yourself, it's not a two-question survey process. And there are people who, and we'll hear from at least one of them this afternoon, who are being raised both. They have some positive connection to the Christian side of their family, whether it may be joining a youth group, going to a church once in a while. They have an element of both in who they are. And my understanding is, and I mean, I know this less than you do, but that kind of a background raises flags for birthright eligibility. So if you're being raised nothing in Jewish, or primarily Jewish, that works, but if you're being raised both Christian and Jewish with institutional connections, then it can raise some challenges. And so, you know, in one case, we might say, we can understand because, you know, they're not fully on board with this team. On the other hand, you might say, well, these are people who are still open to choosing that whole undefinable, making choices, identity in flux period. They're in that too, and they might choose one side. So they have a foot in both worlds, but they might choose one or the other, even if they're being raised in both. So, I mean, I still think Birthright is a fantastic program, but I'd like you to be able to respond to that issue.
Sure. So there are a couple things. First, I don't necessarily feel the need to defend Birthright because I don't think that there are no perfect solutions. There's no silver bullets. And so, on one hand, they've done an incredible, they've done some really incredible things. And on the other hand, it's not perfect. In terms of the process itself, it does raise red flags if you say, I'm this and this. But raising red flags doesn't necessarily mean that you don't get to go, because each person gets an interview. And so it is up to the discretion, not of Birthright itself, actually, but the trip providers who are doing the interviews. If you say, I have accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior, I think that that is absolutely a disqualifier. If you say, I was raised both and I'm questioning and dealing with that, then it's not a disqualifier. So both from the sense of, to sort of clarify what actually is taking place, that's what's actually taking place. But I don't think that it is perfect. It certainly wasn't created perfectly. It's not the only answer. And they are trying to make it better. Great.
Are there other questions from the panelists? Yeah, Lynn?
One of the things I've heard about Birthright, and I've not been, so excuse me if I'm asking something naive, but I understand that the people who go on Birthright are exposed to the best of Israeli society, the most Zionist people in Israeli society, and are less exposed to the conflicts going on.
I will channel my inner Barry Chazan here. Barry created the educational framework for Birthright, and the way that he describes it is, of course we don't show them everything. We have 10 days, right? But what we do show them is an educational framework for how they can understand themselves as Jews, and the connection to Israel both as a historical geographic place that is connected to these stories that they may or may not have heard growing up, to sort of the spiritual components, and to the modern state in its creation. They specifically don't take people to the West Bank. They specifically don't. I think you are required to have one session on the conflict itself, and the guidelines are it has to be balanced. I would say the issue with Birthright right now is one of quality control. And I'm sorry if not everything's coming through the mic, so I'll face out this way. The issue is fundamentally one of quality control, right? Birthright is an umbrella that gives money to different trip providers who have to hit very specific things. They have to go to the Western Wall. They have to go to Masada. They have to do like one cultural program, one environmental program. But there is a huge amount of leeway, actually, as to what they're allowed to do. And each provider is very different. And there are two problems. One is the quality control. The second is information asymmetry. Most people going on Birthright don't actually know which trip provider they're going with and what that trip provider's viewpoint is. And so I shadowed a particular trip, and there was a very interesting woman. I popped in, and she's talking about how hard it is to be an Israeli Arab and how she's a second-class citizen, and all of these sorts of things. And then suddenly, she like puts on a different headscarf, and she's talking in a totally different accent, and she's talking about how hard it is to be a secular Israeli. And it's, she was presenting the cases of 4 different women across the spectrum in Israeli society. Now, not every trip gets that, right? There are trips that get a very pro-right-wing Zionist agenda. There was a trip provider who actually was kicked out of the Birthright enterprise because they were saying things that didn't fit. Birthright got wise to it. For example, they said, you must marry Jewish, you must marry Jewish, you must marry Jewish. Birthright took away their ability to lead Birthright trips. So I would say that the mechanism isn't perfect, and it's not instantaneous, but it is there, and it has been executed. It has been used.
I just want to take this in a slightly different direction, because I know very little about how the inner workings of Birthright, but the question about, warts and all, and not about Israel, but even about Judaism, I think that one of the challenges now in sort of engaging people in Jewish life, and look, a lot of the people that we are trying to engage are much more like their non-Jewish friends than anybody Jewish in terms of their background. And in that sense, you wonder, should we be trying to engage non-Jews as much as people with only one Jewish parent? Because really, what's the difference in terms of because it's not a question of biology or of background. It's really just a question of would you be interested in this Jewish stuff? And actually, if we had something that was compelling to people with one Jewish parent, it probably would be compelling to a lot of non-Jews. So that's a question in itself. But strategically, what I wanted to talk about was, that I think in some ways the difference between getting young people involved in Judaism today versus what it used to be, in a sense, is the difference between an arranged marriage and dating. Right, and in the past you would have said that you have some sort of obligation to get involved with Judaism. That was certainly my mom's opinion. That's a version of an arranged marriage. But if we're now hoping that people will fall in love with Judaism, then you sort of have to think about how should that first date be? How should that second date be? And I always think that if you find out too many bad things about the person on the first date, there isn't going to be a second date. And yet, in the back of your head, everybody's got problems, right? I mean, but I think you should try to discover it on the 10th date. And you want to make sure that you're not setting it up so that you never discover the problems, right? That's a bait and switch. But at the same time, how do you actually organize the dating in such a way that it actually gives you a fighting chance that the person's going to be engaged? Because at the end of the day, you actually think it is worth being engaged in, and you don't want them to, say, I'm never getting involved in this just because you happen to stage the educational process wrong. And I think that that's an interesting educational challenge for us.
There have been a number of audience questions related to Birthright, so I'm going to group them together. Mostly they're concerned with the idea of ancestry and inclusion. So there's a question about whether children who've been adopted into Jewish families are welcome to come, a question about those who identify as Jewish but have no Jewish ancestry, and a question about whether Birthright and similar programs promote a sense of Jewish chauvinism or we're better than other kinds of communities. So you can respond however you'd like.
So I'll frame once again. Next, as a division of the Birthright Israel Foundation, actually was separate from Birthright for a number of years, and we just reintegrated. So I'm happy to answer the questions, but I'm also happy to direct you to people who have a more intimate knowledge of these pieces. So my experience with Birthright is that if you were adopted and you identify as Jewish, 100%, no problems. If you are in the middle of conversion, 100%, no problems. If you've married somebody who's Jewish and you're seriously considering conversion, 100%, no problems. The idea of Jewish chauvinism is an interesting one because I don't know that anyone has solved. I think one of the major issues in Judaism is combining and balancing the particular versus the universal. I don't know that anyone solved that actually. And no, I really don't. No, and I'm actually, I would love to have this conversation with you afterwards, but I don't think anyone has totally solved it. And once again, because so much is left up to trip providers who rely on their tour guides, who rely on their American staff, many of whom are only on the trip because they recruited other people, not because they have any particular business being on this trip. They don't have any particular training or anything like that. There is a huge variety of experiences that people get. And what is amazing to me, given how much I now know about the diversity and the challenges facing it, is that it's had any impact at all. I mean, it's incredible if you think about the total variety of things that could go wrong on this trip, right? You have one person who complains, you have another person who's like this, you have this staff person who's like this, you have, an interaction where you have an Israeli on your trip who says, well, you're not Jewish. What are you doing here? What I think works, actually, is that it shows the diversity of the Jewish people. You go to Israel and suddenly you see most Jews don't look like me. That is a total mind bend to most American Jews who think, because of Ashkenazi immigration to this country, that Ashkenazi Jews are Jews, and that's what Jews look like, right? Most Jews don't look like me, and those Jews who do look like me don't look like me because ancient Jews did, right? I think I said this earlier. Evolution didn't happen this quickly, right? So there are huge differences between trips of the same provider, between trips of different providers, between 22 to 26-year-old trips and 18 to 22-year-old trips. There is a lot of research that has been done on Birthright. Most of it's been done by the Steinhardt Center. What's the name of the institute? Does anyone know? Paul? At Brandeis? The institute's it's at Brandeis. I can't remember the name, but there's a ton of research that they have done on it. That would be an interesting place to start. Mandel Institute. Paul, I think, has some other interesting places that he would recommend looking, I'd guess, too. Which he can contribute as well.
Thank you. Sivan had a question?
Yes. First of all, I have a very short story about evolution. When my daughter was about 6, we were walking home one day, coming back from school, and she said, "Mommy, I learned something in school today." Very quietly, this age when the children are much lower than you, and you don't really hear them, and you're really in a hurry to pick up the rest of the kids and walk to school, and she's mumbling there's something, and then she says something about evolution, and I said, What did you study in school today? She said, "Mommy, I think I studied much better than you."
I studied that I'm much better than you.
I think one of our biggest challenges across the board in Europe, Israel, and North America is public space. That's Jewish space. And what is our place in that space, which according to everything we've heard up to now is where we're at. According to what we've been saying, or you've been saying, is that we have to go to where the people are, and the people are not necessarily in confined Jewish spaces. They are in the public space. Now, for a minute, it may sound to be logical that that's what people do in Israel, because most of the public space, most of the people there are Jewish. But what you're saying, or what I'm hearing, is, people, this is the reality here. The reality here is that this is where the people are. And the question is, what do we do? What should we do in this public space? And what happens is that the challenges in the public space get us to meet not only people who want to be part of Jewish life, but are accidentally there. And just an experience from Israel, a few years ago, I decided that our synagogue or our temple was something like the Starbucks here, something which is called Aroma. It's a chain of coffee houses in Jerusalem and all over the country. And I went to one of these coffee houses and I said, let's have a Kabbalat Shabbat, a Shabbat celebration here. And they said to me, what? What do you mean? And I said, listen, you're always used to the fact that the few jazz musicians are standing in the corner and making music, and nobody runs out of the coffee house because of that. On the contrary, usually people keep coming in. So eventually that's what we did. And it was just more and more people started coming in. And we, in the beginning, we were, embarrassed. We said, oh, poor people, they came to pick up a coffee, and here they're getting a whole celebration of Shabbat. It turned out to be completely different. And the interesting part of this story was that a group of missionaries that were on a trip coming to Israel stepped into the coffee house, and they had a wonderful time with us. So I think we have to redefine what we do in the public space. And I was speaking to Dan before. One of my visions for doing a Jewish and joyful Yom Kippur on one of the campuses is to bring in Leonard Cohen for at least 2 of his songs and to create a service around him. And I believe that in that public space, many people will share a Jewish and joyful event.
Paul?
Well, do you guys want to respond to the public space thing? Because I have something I really, really want to say about it. Almost the whole time I've been at JOI, so for a decade now, we've been promoting a programming model that we call public space Judaism. And we've been encouraging exactly what you're saying to the entire Jewish community, and we've been offering curricular materials and design materials around projects like Passover in the matzah aisle, or we had talked about Chabad a little bit earlier today. You can do a Passover program in your synagogue or in your JCC, and you'll get the regulars who come to your synagogue and JCC for those kind of events. But if you're really trying to reach people, you go where they are. And the weeks before Passover, in highly Jewishly populated cities, and I think Chicago counts, your large supermarkets will set up a whole aisle of seasonal, or holiday or seasonal foods, and let's just be there. It's not proselytizing. We're not trying to convert Christians to Judaism. We're just trying to be there because we know that 75-80% of Jews are going to a Seder, and at any given time, only 35% of them are involved in synagogue or JCC life. So you got the huge percentage of Jews who still find meeting in Passover. Let's go meet them where they are. The challenge is when you talk to them, and even if you collect their information, who's going to call them to follow up with them? Who's going to learn what's meaningful to them? Who's going to find out that they're actually relevant for secular humanistic Judaism as opposed to conservative Judaism, as opposed to Jewish Film Festival? Like, you want to provide people with a relevant next step. But, that's the kind of stuff we've been working on for a long time. So it's really great to hear you say that. And this leads into a question for you guys, because it's also really great to hear what you spoke about in terms of helping people find the meaning and the value in asking these big questions about why be Jewish. And we didn't coordinate our presentations beforehand, so it's great that these are the conclusions that we're all drawing. I'm wondering, do you have a sense or examples of the way that the young people that you work with in Hillel on campus or in Birthright Israel are answering those questions? And that's part one. And part two is it any different between the heirs of intermarriage and those coming from two Jewish parents?
So I just want to say one thing about the public space question, because I think we can see the public space as two different possibilities. One is that we are in some way bringing the Judaism that generally takes place in the private space out to the public space. And we're somehow translating the Judaism from the synagogue or wherever to the public space. I think that that's valid. I think we should be doing that. But I don't actually think that that's what the future is. I think what the future is to create a new Judaism from the public space and to create something new around it. And I don't think a lot of us have even begun that project in earnest yet. And the question is, what would that look like? What would it look like if Sivan's synagogue in the coffee shop started to do bar mitzvahs in the coffee shop, right? I mean, started to create a whole community, a Hebrew school that took place in the juice bar next door. I mean, what would that look like? And I think that that's an important piece. That these disruptive innovations tend to work where they're targeted at the current non-consumers. And if you can find something that really works for the non-consumers, the marginal consumers of the current product will start to move over, because I'm talking about all the people that are paying $2,000 a year in synagogue dues and only show up one day a year. My guess is they'd be much more interested in Sivan's thing, and therefore they would take their $2,000 and bring it over there, and you could start to really build something, right? And then once the marginal consumers are all over there, well, first of all, the old system collapses because it's only economically sustainable because of the marginal users. But that's not the goal. But then the other people start to say, hey, that thing, what's going on there? That seems like it's attracting a lot of people, and you start to pull. And that's why I was saying earlier that I don't think that the answer really is to try to get the conservative movement to change. I think that the answer is to build a compelling alternative that will pull away the marginal members of the conservative movement, which will then force the conservative movement to change.
It's called the reform movement.
No, I actually think not. But that's another. We can get because. But I think that fundamentally this presses a question that I think gets to your question, which is that fundamentally we need to ask ourselves, what is Judaism, or what should Judaism be for the future? And I think that I definitely think meaning is right, is a piece. I use the word, and I use the word Judaism is a technology, and by that I mean it's a tool. Judaism is many things. It's been many things, a history, a community, all these things. But I think that one of the most compelling things going into the future is to understand Judaism as a tool for living a good life and for making a contribution to the world. And I think that that's what people want. I think that's what young people want. I think people know that they aren't living the best lives that they can be living. They're not being the best selves that they can be. They have values that they're not actually able to live out in the world. Like, I don't give as much charity as I know that I should. And I really appreciate the deadline of tax day, forcing me to have a deadline by December 31st, because, like, if I didn't have a deadline, I wouldn't do it. And so I really appreciate those structures and frameworks. I think Judaism is potentially all about structures and frameworks. It's just that we sort of lost the connection between the structures and frameworks and the meaning and the good lives that they're intended to. So I don't think we should throw that away. I think we need to reboot it, basically. And I think that is what young people respond to. But even more than young people responding to it, I found that baby boomers are responding to it, because they're more mature and understand that they need those tools. So it's not just young people, is my point, that we should be thinking about other ages. Just the last thing I'll say is that what I've really been experiencing a lot, interesting, is that I've been talking in particular to women in their 50s. I think it's just because the men don't talk. But that have basically been saying to me, when my kids left the house, all of a sudden I realized that not only does Judaism not mean anything to me, it's never meant anything to me, right? I was doing it only because I thought that I had to do this stuff for my kids. And so all of a sudden there's a crisis of meaning in people's 50s, right? Which is an enormous crisis and an enormous opportunity because, among other things, those people actually have money, and if they found meaning in the Jewish world, they would support it. And I think that there's real opportunity to rebuild a Judaism in the public space and in the private space that really is a Judaism of meaning and of use.
I'll get to you next, but there's.
I was going to respond right to you.
Oh, sure, you first.
I was just gonna respond like very on a tachlis level to what you asked, which is that generally the children, people who have one Jewish parent versus people who have two Jewish parents, are asking for the same type of opportunities. If they're right out of college, they want to meet people. They want to have a sense of social community. As they get a little bit older and things are starting to settle, that they can think about bigger issues, they're looking for meaning, they're looking for learning. I would say that if there is a difference that I've sort of seen in my experience, and certainly when Erica comes up on the next panel, she's met with hundreds of people. The experience that I had that was where people asked different questions was, and is this going to be a place that I feel welcome? Mm-hmm. And those places that were the places that they would feel welcome are the places that actually are going to be most attractive to people with two Jewish parents as well.
It's similar to the question from the audience I was going to ask, which is, it sounds like you're doing great work in terms of engagement, but some people here are wondering whether people who identify as secular humanistic Jews will feel comfortable coming to some of these events and joining some of these organizations.
It depends on the events and the organizations, right? I mean, the idea, what is a vibrant Jewish community? A vibrant Jewish community is one in which there is a spectrum, right? And there are enough opportunities that we can all engage in the ways that are of primary interest and value to us. Not all of the things with meaning are necessarily religious rituals. I went to a conversation the other night that looked at, from an intellectual perspective, how does Judaism look at connecting with the idea of revelation? Like, what does that mean from an intellectual perspective? And how does that apply not just to some sort of spiritual sense, but how does that apply to the way that we live our lives? Because there's a really interesting way in the way that sort of God is revealed to Moses and several other prophets and folks in our literature, that's actually, you can read it in a way of psychology, actually. A person is running away from something that they need to deal with. It was causing them mental anguish. Suddenly something happens that they're forced to confront it, and something great comes from it. That's incredible, and that's part of our tradition. And so there are things, look, if you're uncomfortable with the idea of, it has to be noted that a lot of young adults who are doing things that would be considered religious or spiritual, when they're doing it, they're not doing it in the way of sort of American Christian-centric religion, right? They're not using God in what it's come to mean to my parents' generation when they say the word God. They're understanding it from a deeply mystical sense in some regards that's not necessarily supernatural. There was something that Rabbi Shalom said about not supernatural. They're approaching it in different ways. So from a totally tachlis thing, yes, there are things going on in the community that people who have no connection or want no connection to the idea of God are finding value in. B, there are different ways that people who are finding connection and value in God even approach that than in previous generations. And C, we need to create more of both.
Adam?
I just want to say one quick thing about what I find among young people is that they're remarkably non-ideological. And this is really, really important because I think that the secular humanistic movement faces the same challenges that all the other movements face in this regard, which is that young people are not interested in your ideology. They're not interested in any ideology. They're interested in what moves them, what works. And they're not going to not attend there's an independent minyan called Mishkan, which has a lot of music, and they're not going to not attend that because it mentions the word God. I think that actually, my guess is that a lot of secular humanistic Jewish young people will feel very comfortable in Mishkan, but you might not like that because they're not actually subscribing to the. Oh, hey, Lizzie. They're not. That's the rabbi of Mishkan. They're not because they are willing to say things that they don't believe in, right? And that's not the ideology of the movement. And I think that that's something that all the movements are really going to have to think about. I'm an empiricist. I'm in the school of Dewey and a sort of pragmatist, saying, I'm excited about the emergence of a Judaism that really moves people. I don't really care what the ideology is. I believe that Jews need to be freed to discover the Judaism that really moves them, and that is what will create a Judaism that I'll be excited for my grandchildren to be a part of. And I think that that's a question and a threat to every movement.
Well, I'll have a longer answer on Sunday. But what I wanted to suggest with this question of empowerment is I'm not only the Dean for North America of our institute, but I'm also a congregational rabbi in the suburbs, not in the urban setting. And so what I'm hearing is both exciting and fearful. It leaves me with this sense of fear and trembling at the same time. Because on one hand, we get the excitement of empowerment and engagement and creating new things and make it relevant to you, all the kind of things we've been saying. And at the same time, it's let them do it themselves. Run your own. Who needs communities? Who needs organizations? And some questions come to mind. The first is, I'd like to eat. But on a more pragmatic level, well, that's today. I need to eat for a lifetime, right? But pragmatically, where are these people going to get the resources to create these experiences? They need training. They need people who know what they're doing. In theory, a rabbi doesn't have to be an old man saying no, just like the old model of God. It can be a young person saying, yes, here's how you do it. But it takes time. It takes training. They have to eat. All those things need to happen to be able to support the resources. And so we talked about the fee-for-service model, but there's a certain point at which people want services without fees. The internet generation is not simply a great way to sell things on Amazon or to buy things on Amazon. You talk about the death of death of the retail store. Now it's the death of the big box store because of Amazon. Well, what happens next to Jewish professionals who have expertise, who have training, but who need to make a living? Fee-for-service is just not going to be enough. So maybe philanthropy makes the difference. Maybe the Jewish community as a whole puts resources behind it. Maybe you charge $10,000 for a freelance bar mitzvah. I mean, there are some ways you can try to do it. But it's going to be a challenge. But the flip side of that is, and I think that our movement does have some strengths to address some of these concerns, and that is first and foremost our approach that communities make up their own liturgy, rituals, and resources. So Yoni said, the service on Friday night, it was, even if the content was different, it was still a ritualized presentation, and it didn't have that kind of critical engagement. My first action to anybody who would come to an event and have that response would be, we have a liturgy committee. You are welcome to get involved with a group of people and wrestle with it and make the changes. When I was a college student, I went to the humanistic group in Connecticut, and their approach to their high holiday services were, if you complain, you're on the committee to revise it for the next year. and that way you both have to take responsibility for your complaining, but also you have that opportunity for engagement and empowerment. So maybe it's fewer readings, responsive readings, fewer formalized things, and more opportunities for discussion. There is a place for hearing performative music. There's a place for singing all together. There's a place for having a reading and thinking about it, a place for silence, a time to speak, a time to be silent. I mean, those are all part of what would make a meaningful experience. But this is the last challenge. When you're empowering people out there as individuals, as couples and families, even as small friendship circles, you get the risk of atomization. That is, I have my Jewish community. It's these two family friends. We run our own little Sunday school for our two kids, and that's it. And that can be a wonderfully meaningful, empowering, transformative experience for people. But the flip side is that you lose that value of 100 voices singing together or feeling part of a larger Jewish community when you're never with a larger Jewish community. So I think that those are some of the challenges in responding to what you say. I mean, our challenge is we're out there in the Jewish community now. We have to start working now to create it. And the last thing I want to offer is this. that our approach to philosophy is not simply an allergy to vocabulary. It really is a reorientation and that kind of technology you're talking about to live a better life. When you live a humanistic lifestyle, you are feeling empowered to be in charge of your own life. You're not hoping for healing. You're not waiting for miracles. You're not following the rules just because you were told to do it. You are instead living a self-actualized experience of owning your Judaism, but also owning yourself, and owning your personal life. Now, maybe the way we present it needs to change. Maybe it needs to be a technology, this is good for you, not just you should do it because Bubby said so. But I think in the long run that re-messaging doesn't have to mean a radical change in philosophy, but it does mean responding to the needs of this audience. This is fantastic market research for us of who these people are, of what we need to do, half Jewish, full Jewish, whatever that means. All of this is crucial for us. So I certainly want to take the time to thank both of you for bringing your insight and experience to us, even if it gives us fear, even if we don't know what the future is going to be. We need to hear these things to know how to frame the best of what we have for what's coming in the future.
So I just want... just a quick response. I told to wrap it up quickly, but that's a very long and important question. But AJ did tell me earlier that at previous colloquia there have been points at which people almost came to blows. So I hope you're not going to jump across the table at me. But I would say one thing, that I do think that we're in a moment of profound change in the meaning of being Jewish. I think that change is a long time coming. I think it started with the Enlightenment and the Emancipation, and we still haven't fully adjusted, and these changes do take hundreds of years. I think the last change started with the invasion of Alexander the Great, and it ended with the destruction of the Second Temple. They took hundreds of years, and I think that that this change. If we were living at the time of the Second Temple, right, we would say, how are all these priests going to eat? The sacrifices is how they, right? That's how they eat. It literally was, right?
Well, they get the first aliyah.
Right, and that's I think a really significant thing to understand about the transition from Second Temple Judaism to Rabbinic Judaism, is that Rabbinic Judaism was a much cheaper Judaism. It was a Judaism. It was an economically important transition. It was a Judaism in which the rabbis all had other jobs. They were what we would call lay leaders today. That's why there was Rab Yosef the shoemaker or whatever, right? Because he was a shoemaker, right? Right, Rashi was a winemaker, and for a very long time, that transition was, and I think that we're, unfortunately, for those of us, including myself, who make our living this way, I don't think that these institutions are going to be able to sustain the level of professional leadership that we have today, and I think that's actually, again, I see that as a reality, as a fact, as something that we have to figure out how to deal with, as opposed to stopping. And if we can see it that way, then it's an exciting opportunity to be the one or two that the community can still afford to pay. And that's what I'm planning to do, and I hope you will too.
Well, I'd be curious to see, you mentioned your wife handles paying all the bills. I'd be curious for her perspective on this dynamic change.
She's not here.
Please join me in thanking Dan and Yoni for such an amazing presentation.